In a hospital lab in Haifa, a kidney doctor with no formal training in genetics decides, almost as a hobby, to test a story from the Bible using a blood sample. In southern Africa, a tribe that has spent centuries insisting it descends from ancient Israelite priests turns out to be carrying a genetic marker that should, by every reasonable expectation, not be there. In Eastern Europe, geneticists trace nearly half of an entire population, 8 million people, back to 4 women who lived roughly 2,000 years ago. And across 14 separate Jewish communities scattered from Yemen to India to Ethiopia, DNA now shows something that no single origin story, not the simple one and not the conspiracy-flavored one, ever fully predicted. This is not a story about proving who counts as Jewish. Genetics cannot do that, and it was never supposed to. This is a story about what happens when you actually go looking at the DNA behind one of the most argued about origin questions in human history, a question that has produced centuries of theology, more than a century of pseudoscience, and only in the last 2 decades, a genuinely rigorous body of peer-reviewed research trying to sort out what the evidence actually supports. This is not folklore dressed up as science. The core research comes from real peer-reviewed institutions. The Technion and Rambam Healthcare Campus in Haifa, the University of Arizona, Tel Aviv University, and the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York, published in journals like Nature and the American Journal of Human Genetics. The lead names recur across decades of this research, geneticists like Doron Bahar, Carl Skorecki, Michael Hammer, and Harry Oster, each building on and independently testing the other's findings. This is a field with disagreements inside it, real scientific pushback between papers, which is exactly the kind of friction that makes a field trustworthy rather than a field that simply confirms whatever it set out to find. And this is not a niche corner of biology either. Population genetics of this kind now sits alongside archaeology, linguistics, and textual history as one of the primary tools researchers use to test claims about ancient migration that written records alone can never fully settle, because written records are produced by whoever happened to be literate, powerful, or paying attention at the time, while DNA is inherited by everyone, regardless of whether anyone ever wrote their story down. Before getting into what the DNA actually shows, it's worth walking through the popular stories already floating around this topic, because each one sounds plausible and each one runs into a wall of actual data. The first and weakest is the idea that the Jewish people have always been one simple, unbroken, genetically uniform bloodline, unchanged for 3,000 years, regardless of where in the world a community ended up. It's an understandable assumption, since shared religious law, shared texts, and shared ritual practice really have persisted across enormous distances and centuries. But the moment researchers actually sequenced genome-wide data from 14 Jewish diaspora communities and compared them against 69 non-Jewish populations, in the landmark 2010 study led by Doron Bahar and published in Nature, the one uniform bloodline idea didn't survive first contact with the data. Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Syrian Jews clustered closely together. Mizrahi and Yemenite Jewish communities formed their own distinguishable clusters. Ethiopian Jews, known as Beta Israel, and Indian Jewish communities such as the Beni Israel, showed yet another pattern entirely, shaped heavily by centuries of local intermarriage and regional ancestry, rather than by close genetic proximity to communities further north. A single bloodline does not split into that many statistically distinct branches. A long, complicated diaspora does. The second popular theory is louder and considerably more contested. The claim that European Jewish communities, particularly Ashkenazi Jews, have essentially no real Middle Eastern ancestry at all, and instead descend primarily from local European converts, sometimes tied specifically to the medieval Khazar Khanate along the Volga. It's a theory with real intellectual history behind it, not something invented out of nowhere, popularized decades ago in books like Arthur Koestler's The 13th Tribe, and revived more recently in academic papers by researchers such as Iran El-Haik, and it has genuine appeal because it explains, on its surface, why many Ashkenazi Jews look phenotypically similar to their Central and Eastern European neighbors, and because a Khazar conversion narrative really is documented, at least in outline, in medieval sources. But when Behar's 2010 genome-wide study, and separately a 2010 study led by Harry Oster's team at Albert Einstein College of Medicine titled Abraham's Children in the Genome Era, both examined the actual autosomal data, they found something the Khazar origin theory doesn't account for, a consistent, shared Middle Eastern ancestral component running through nearly every Jewish diaspora population studied, Ashkenazi included, and a close genetic relationship specifically with Levantine populations, such as Druze and Cypriot communities, populations with no obvious reason to share ancestry with European Jews, unless that ancestry traces back to a common point of origin in the Middle East. Two independent research teams using different samples and different statistical methods landed on the same core finding. That kind of agreement is hard to wave away, and it means the Khazar conversion narrative, whatever role it may have played in Ashkenazi history at the margins, cannot account for the core Middle Eastern signal running through the population as a whole. The third theory sits closer to blanket skepticism than to a specific claim. The assumption that when far-flung communities around the world, communities with no obvious historical connection to the Mediterranean, claim descent from ancient Israelites, those claims are almost always cultural mythology with no genetic basis whatsoever. And to be fair, this skepticism is usually reasonable because plenty of lost tribe claims really do lack any supporting evidence, and researchers in this field are the first to say so. But this is exactly the theory that produces the strangest, most specific exception in the entire field, and it's the one that finally pulls this whole story somewhere nobody expected. In the next part of this, we go straight into the actual genetic method these researchers used, and then into that exception itself, because it's the thread that ties the entire picture together. Quick recap before we go further, because the pattern already forming here matters. A single uniform bloodline doesn't hold up against genome-wide clustering data. A theory that erases Middle Eastern ancestry entirely doesn't hold up against two independent research teams finding the same shared component. And blanket skepticism toward every distant claim of Israelite descent is about to run headfirst into the one case where the genetics agree with the oral tradition. 3 theories in, and the real picture is already more layered than any of them alone. To understand what these studies are actually measuring, it helps to think of the human genome less like a single fixed blueprint and more like a very long, very detailed travel journal that gets copied from parent to child, with small handwriting changes creeping in every generation. Researchers can compare thousands of these journal entries across different populations and measure how closely they match, the same way you might notice that 2 strangers' travel journals both mention the same obscure guest house in the same small town decades apart, and reasonably conclude they, or their families, passed through that exact place at some point. That is roughly how genome-wide clustering works, and it is why the 2010 studies could sort 14 diaspora communities into distinct groups without knowing anything in advance about where each community's ancestors supposedly came from. The pattern emerges from the data itself, not from the researchers' assumptions going in. Layered on top of that whole genome comparison is a second, more specific tool, the Y chromosome, which passes from father to son almost unchanged, like a baton handed off silently down a single male line, generation after generation, never rewritten by the other parent's contribution the way most of the genome is. There is a mirror image tool on the maternal side too, mitochondrial DNA, passed down only from mothers, which becomes important later in this story. Between these 3 methods, whole genome comparison, paternal Y chromosome tracing, and maternal mitochondrial tracing, researchers can triangulate a population's history from 3 separate angles at once, and when all 3 point in a similar direction, that convergence is what turns an interesting hypothesis into a well-supported finding. That baton-passing property of the Y chromosome is precisely what let Karl Skorecki's team test something oddly specific in 1997. The biblical claim that the Jewish priesthood, the Kohanim, descends in an unbroken male line from a single ancestor, traditionally identified as Aaron, roughly 3,300 years ago. Skorecki, working with Michael Hammer at the University of Arizona, gathered Y chromosome samples from Jewish men who self-identified as Kohanim, alongside men who identified as Levites or as ordinary lay Israelites across both Ashkenazi and Sephardic communities. If priestly lineage really had been passed strictly from father to son for 3 millennia, the Kohanim should show a distinct genetic signature that lay Jews didn't share, regardless of whether those Kohanim happened to live in Britain, North America, or Israel. That is exactly what the 1997 Nature paper found. A specific set of Y chromosome markers, later named the Cohen modal haplotype, showed up at strikingly elevated frequency among self-identified Kohanim in both Ashkenazi and Sephardic populations, despite those 2 communities having been geographically separated for over 1,000 years. It didn't matter whether the Cohen surveyed traced his family to Vilnius or to Baghdad. The same marker kept turning up in the same priestly line. Later refinement work by Hammer, Bahar, and Skorecki, published in 2009, and drawing on a larger sample of over 1,500 Jewish men, estimated the shared ancestral chromosome behind this haplotype to somewhere between roughly 2,100 and 3,250 years ago, a window that lines up strikingly well with the period between the traditional biblical exodus and the destruction of the First Temple. If a single genetic marker managing to survive intact across 1,000 years of geographic separation between Ashkenazi and Sephardic communities is the kind of detail that makes you want to know what else this research turned up, that curiosity is worth following because the maternal side of this story is about to get even stranger. Here's the part that connects back to the female side of the story. In 2006, Behar's team turned the same kind of analysis toward mitochondrial DNA, the maternal counterpart to the Y chromosome, specifically inside Ashkenazi Jewish communities. And the result was, in the researcher's own description, close to jaw-dropping. Close to 1/2 of Ashkenazi Jews, and Ashkenazi Jewry at the time numbered somewhere around 8 million people worldwide, could be traced back to only 4 women. 4 women. That is not a broad ancestral pool. That is a genetic bottleneck so narrow it reshaped the maternal ancestry of an entire diaspora population within roughly the last 1,000 years. To put that scale in perspective, imagine walking through a city roughly the size of Philadelphia and realizing that nearly every third person you pass shares a maternal line great-great-great-grandmother with the person next to them, a bottleneck that happened within a time frame not much longer than the centuries separating us from the Crusades. That is how narrow and how recent this founding event actually was. Historians studying the same period point to exactly the kind of demographic pressure that could produce a bottleneck this severe. Repeated waves of expulsion, plague, and resettlement across medieval Europe, which could easily have collapsed a once larger maternal gene pool down to a handful of surviving lineages before the population expanded again in the centuries that followed, growing from an estimated 25,000 people around the year 1300 to well over 8 million by the early 20th century. Now here's where the story gets its strangest twist, and where that third popular theory, the blanket skepticism toward far-flung claims of Israelite descent, runs into its one genuine exception. Everything so far has pointed toward a Middle Eastern origin that fragmented and bottlenecked as it moved through Europe and the Near East. This next piece takes that same thread somewhere almost nobody expects. Not Europe at all, but Southern Africa. In Southern Africa, a group known as the Lemba have maintained an oral tradition for generations that their ancestors were Jewish men who migrated from the Middle East and eventually intermarried into local African communities, retaining fragments of dietary law, circumcision practice, and a specific priestly clan structure along the way. For a long time, this was treated the way most such claims are treated, as compelling oral history without independent confirmation. Then, in a study, led by Mark Thomas and published in 2000, researchers tested Y chromosome samples from Lemba men and found something unexpected: significantly elevated frequencies of the Cohen modal haplotype, the same marker Skrecki's team had identified in Jewish priestly lines, concentrated specifically within the Lemba's own priestly clan, known as the Buba. The rest of the Lemba genome overwhelmingly reflects local Southern African ancestry, as you would expect from a community that has lived and intermarried in the region for many centuries, likely for well over 1,000 years. But that one specific paternal thread, sitting inside that one specific priestly clan, matches a marker researchers first identified on the other side of the world, in men who had never heard of the Lemba and had no reason to expect any connection to them. If you're finding this as strange as I did the first time I came across it, that reaction is exactly why this research keeps circulating in academic circles decades after it was first published. And it's a good moment to hit subscribe if you want the rest of this thread followed all the way through, because the next section is where these 3 separate lines of evidence, the genome-wide clustering, the priestly Y chromosome markers, and the maternal founder event, all start pointing at the same underlying picture rather than 3 unrelated stories. What all 3 lines of evidence are actually converging on is a Jewish population history defined less by a single unbroken bloodline and more by repeated cycles of a shared Middle Eastern point of origin, followed by long periods of geographic separation, local intermarriage, and demographic bottlenecking. Differently, in nearly every region, a Jewish community eventually settled. Ashkenazi communities show a strong, narrow maternal founder effect layered on top of Near Eastern paternal signatures. Mizrahi and Sephardic communities show closer, more continuous genetic proximity to broader Middle Eastern populations, consistent with less geographic separation over the centuries. Ethiopian Jews, the Beta Israel, show a genetic structure distinct enough from other diaspora populations that Behar's 2010 study singled them out as their own cluster, reflecting deep integration with neighboring East African populations over a very long and still historically debated period of separation. The Bene Israel of India show a similar pattern in a different direction, carrying a detectable shared ancestral component alongside a genome that is otherwise overwhelmingly South Asian, consistent with a small founding group that settled on the Konkan coast centuries ago and was absorbed into, rather than replaced by, the population around them. None of these patterns cancel each other out. They are what 2,000 years of dispersal actually looks like when you can finally measure it directly instead of guessing from historical texts and folklore alone. Before going any further, it's worth being completely honest about where the science genuinely stops, because this is a topic where overstating a real finding causes real harm, and where this exact kind of research has been misused before in deeply damaging ways. Population genetics can describe patterns of shared ancestry across large groups of people. It cannot and should not be used to decide who is or is not Jewish. Jewish identity, historically and today, is defined through religious law, community recognition, and personal lineage, or conversion, not through a genetic test. And a great many fully Jewish people, whether by conversion or by adoption into Jewish communities generations ago, carry no detectable Middle Eastern ancestry at all. That does not make their identity any less real, and no legitimate geneticist working in this field claims otherwise. In fact, when a rabbinical institute in Jerusalem once floated the idea of using specific mitochondrial markers to help verify Jewish descent for individuals lacking documentary proof, geneticists in this very field pushed back publicly, warning that using population-level ancestry markers to adjudicate individual religious status was a misapplication of the science, since these markers only describe probability across large groups, not certainty for any one person. That pushback from within the field itself is worth remembering whenever this kind of research gets cited outside its proper context. It is also worth saying plainly that the 20th century saw this exact category of research, population ancestry and racial classification, twisted into pseudoscientific justification for some of the worst atrocities in modern history. And every serious researcher in this field today works carefully to separate population-level genetic history from any claim about hierarchy, purity, or biological essentialism, because those claims never had scientific grounding to begin with, and this research provides a none now. Ancestry is not destiny, and shared ancestry is not the basis of anyone's worth. What this research actually offers is something narrower and, in its own way, more useful. A partial, honest, occasionally surprising record of where groups of people moved, mixed, and settled over a few thousand years, nothing more and nothing less. There is also genuine, ongoing scientific disagreement inside this field that deserves mention rather than being smoothed over for the sake of a clean story. Behar's 2006 finding that the 4 Ashkenazi founding maternal lineages likely originated in the Near East was challenged in a 2013 reanalysis led by Marta Costa, which argued, using a broader comparative data set, that those same 4 lineages may actually trace to a European rather than Middle Eastern origin. That disagreement has not been fully settled, and it should not be flattened into false certainty in either direction, however satisfying a firm answer might feel. Likewise, the Lemba finding is a population-level, clan-specific result. It does not mean every individual Lemba man carries this marker, and it does not amount to individually testing or confirming any specific historical figure's lineage, biblical or otherwise. It also does not mean every community that claims a connection to ancient Israel will produce a comparable genetic signal, since the Lemba case remains one of the more striking exceptions in this research rather than the rule. Where the evidence is genuinely strong, this video has said so plainly. Where it remains contested, that uncertainty is the honest answer, not a footnote to bury. So return to that lab in Haifa for a second. The nephrologist testing a Bible story almost as a side project, because that image says correct down to the letter, and nobody ended up proving that either. What they found instead was something stranger and more human. A population that scattered across 4 continents, split into communities that barely spoke to each other for 1,000 years at a stretch, and somehow still carries measurable, overlapping threads, reaching back toward a shared point of origin, threads visible in a priestly clan in southern Africa and in the mitochondria of women in Eastern Europe, who never met and never could have known about each other. The story was never as simple as one bloodline unbroken through history, and it was never as simple as no connection at all either. It was always something in between, harder to summarize and far more interesting. A history written not in any single text, but in the overlapping DNA of people who, for 2,000 years, mostly just kept living their lives, moving, marrying, adapting, and, without ever intending to, leaving behind exactly the kind of evidence that would eventually let a handful of scientists 2 millennia later start piecing the whole scattered story back together. Every genome sequenced since Behar's first paper has added another data point to that reconstruction, and every community studied so far has told a slightly different version of the same underlying journey, which may be the most fitting outcome a study of diaspora could ever produce. Tell me in the comments which finding surprised you more, the 4 women behind, nearly half of Ashkenazi ancestry, or the priestly clan in southern Africa carrying a marker first identified on the other side of the world. Either way, the deeper lesson might be the same one geneticists keep landing on across every population they study, that any group's history, examined closely enough and honestly enough, turns out to be more tangled, more improbable, and more worth telling than the version that fits neatly on a single page.